Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about some of the key elements in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires that can make for a much better campaign experience and a more replayable one. Not all of the best Legendary Lords in the game, or my personal favorite Legendary Lords in the game, will have all of these elements, but having at least a couple of them will absolutely improve your overall campaign experience. So first off, let's talk about flexibility. Flexibility in terms of terrain, flexibility in terms of having a good portion of the campaign map available to you. It doesn't necessarily matter if you have all of the climate types available. You can have a lot of climate types and your campaign can still feel restricted. Or you can have only a couple of climate types and still have a good amount of freedom. This is one of the key elements for the Empire, because you do have the Empire, you do have the Border Princes, you do then also have Nehekara, and you also have the jungle. Though why exactly you'd want to go in the jungle, that's up to you to decide. But still, you do have that kind of flexibility where it actually matters. But that's only a portion of it. On top of that is flexibility with generals, be it having generals of the Empire or Arch-Selectors in the Empire case, Huntsman General or Master Engineers for Ranged Lords, Caster Lords, and same with heroes. Having melee heroes, ranged heroes, support heroes, magic users, it is all very, very important because it allows you to respond with to different situations in different ways. And also promotes a greater diversity in terms of your armies, which is a lot more fun than just recruiting the same units over and over and over again in every single campaign that you're playing. This is where a race like the Empire and a couple of others do absolutely shine in, because they do have that diversity of units in ranged, infantry, artillery, cavalry. Sure, their infantry may not be the best in the game, but it does get the job done where it actually matters. They don't have flying units, but the Empire is just an example. It is the idea of having the flexibility with different units, different heroes, different lords, different climate, and even research, which is actually an area where the Empire is severely lacking because their research tree is not necessarily the best. Flexibility. Flexibility in all aspects, being able to respond quickly and efficiently to different situations across the campaign map with different unit recruitment that is widely available. I am not interested to talk about a race that has a bunch of awesome units at tier 4 and tier 5. I'm interested in a race that has great unit selection at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. This is where the Empire shines. Because if you look at the unit roster over here, you may notice that the vast majority of the units of the Empire are available until tier 4. And there's only a handful of units that are available at tier 5. And crucially, those are more support units. And you also have early game options available, like you can use Ragsguard and Blood Knights of the Blazing Sign or Knights of the Black Rose, as opposed to the Demigryphs. This is what makes for a much better campaign experience. Next up, we have the Autoresolve situation in the game. Now, Autoresolve is a very tricky affair to talk about as a system in the game, because it does vary quite a lot, dependent on difficulty as well as faction potential, because Creative Assembly's idea of changing the difficulty of the game was to ensure that the AI inherently got an Autoresolve benefit if you set the battle difficulty higher, and also that the AI got an Autoresolve benefit if they had a huge amount of faction potential. It ended up having quite a few problems as a result of that. But the primary factors that do determine your Autoresolve result are as follows. Armor, as well as the kind of army you're building. So an army that is split between melee units and ranged units may take more damage on those melee units. Or an army that has a couple of melee units will take more damage than one that has a more dedicated roster of either range or melee units in it. And yes, that can absolutely be a problem, but the best races and the best campaigns in Warhammer 3 are ones where you're inherently, when you're playing them, you are going to strive to get that kind of army that does handle things well. So it's a question of unit variety. The other thing that matters is armor. But how much armor? You don't want to have a situation where you're just auto-resolving every single battle in a campaign. But you also don't want to have a situation where you're having to fight every single battle for every single minor settlement manually. Because, as you might imagine, that is not a particularly fun and engaging experience. And I can tell you as a content creator, a lot of people don't want to watch those battles. And people also especially don't want to watch siege battles. So it is trying to find that middle ground of what ends up working. Races like Warriors of Chaos just flat out break the system because they have units, they have a melee focused roster with a lot of units with very heavy armor, over 100. So from my point of view, is races like Kislev or the Dwarves that do succeed in this, or Cafe actually. Because you see, you look at Kislev, you look at Cafe, you look at the Dwarves to an extent, to a lesser extent, because Dwarves can be a bit ridiculous in Autoresolve. You see races that have 70, 80, 90 armor. Anything more than 100 ends up being ridiculous, especially when you're looking at Khorne or you're looking at Warriors of Chaos. See, Khorne isn't not inherently a really powerful race as much as people make it seem to be, but what makes them seem so ridiculous is they're a melee-focused faction against a bunch of units who have very high armor, so they can out-resolve pretty much every battle in their campaign. That is what really makes Khorne ridiculous. If you actually fight the battles manually, it's less so than many other races. So it is that kind of balancing act that you need to have in a campaign to make it worthwhile. Another key factor over here with regards to Autoresolve is the ability of having access to casualty replenishment in a campaign. Because if you're playing a race, especially a race that has units with low durability, so they'll inherently take more damage, but if you're playing a race or you're playing an army with low durability units that are, because of the army composition, is inherently going to take more damage in Autoresolve or even manual battles, and then you're struggling to recover, and that is really bad. It's also bad, again, to just wipe the floor with everything in your path. So you have to find that kind of solid middle ground where you're fighting the interesting battles in a campaign and you're avoiding the useless fluff. I think Kislev does manage it. Dwarves, you might say they can be a bit ridiculous. Keep in mind, though, what dwarves have to deal with on a regular basis in their campaigns. You might get away with a lot of things in a dwarf campaign, but eventually the debt will be paid. And you are going to suffer if you just rely on that and not resolve. Unless you're playing Grumbrindle, but then Grumbrindle's Grumbrindle. He's just flat out fucking ridiculous. So you gotta have that kind of solid middle ground between too much power and too little in terms of auto-resolve. And I think only a handful of races in Warhammer 3 do manage this. Further down the list is the question of Burnout, specifically with unique campaign mechanics or campaign mechanics in general. Because requiring the player to do certain things that aren't really that engaging, but you want to do them every single turn in order to maximize your campaign potential isn't really a great situation. So the best campaigns and the best campaign experiences is where that is minimized. There are certainly mods that do help with that. So if you're dealing with a lot of item management, there is the Fusion Wizard mod that does help you with that a lot. So you don't have to click a bunch of buttons to get the end result. But beyond the inherent situation of managing heroes, managing lords, managing items, managing an empire, there's also campaign mechanics where things can go really well or things can work very poorly. A great example of a campaign where this doesn't work so well is Elfarion the Grimm's campaign. Specifically, because while Elfarion is absolutely a powerful legendary lord in his own right, the way his unique campaign mechanic works is requiring you to play the campaign in such a way as to maximize his potential, but isn't especially fun. Because Elfarion wants to capture lords in battle. Every single army in his campaign has a specific ability, the Warden's Cage, that does allow him to capture lords in battles. And you then go to the dungeons, Batman's dungeons over here, and then you either execute or indoctrinate them for various benefits in your campaign. And crucially, you gain Warden Supply, which unlocks various upgrades over here in this campaign. Usually it's better to indoctrinate them, but it is a fairly tedious process. Not because of the management on the campaign side of things, but because of the management in battles. So every time you're fighting a battle, you're not going to use Warden Cage automatically. You're also not going to want to kill enemy lords, so you're constantly distracted when you're playing battles like, oh, is the lord dead? Is he about to die? Can I capture him now? Is it right to use the ability at the moment? Do I need to move my units in a certain way? Do I have to fight a lot more battles manually in this campaign as opposed to others in order to maximize my campaign potential? It ends up feeling really annoying, partly because of the way you end up fighting battles in a campaign as Elfarion. Again, great legendary lord, but also because you end up having to fight a lot more battles than you otherwise would want in a campaign as Elfarian, neither of which is really a great option in general in Warhammer 3. And then combine that with various issues of the High Elves and the tedium of management of the High Elves with their influence system, and the way that you just suddenly all of a sudden get a lot of heroes all at once through the short campaign victory condition, you can kind of understand how this ends up being very, very freaking tedious very quickly. A campaign that does this system, that does have a unique campaign mechanic and does it very well, is Ikeclaw. Unlike, say, Fraught, where you have to individually manage unit customization, it's powerful, it gets the job done, but with Ikeclaw, you just have faction-wide benefits that do freaking work. You get them, you unlock them, you're done. You don't have to worry about it. It's no longer a hassle in your campaign. Just go out there and build nukes once you're done with that. That is a freaking great system. And for all my personal misgivings about Ikeclaw's campaign, specifically starting his position, I can't deny that his unique campaign mechanic just freaking works. Not just because it's powerful. Astankia is powerful, but it's just like Elfarian, a very tedious system to manage. So that is the difference between a really good Legendary Lord that gives you a great experience and one that gives you an inferior experience like Astankia. Having to just, click a bunch of buttons in every single turn after turn after turn is not especially great in itself. Especially worse when you're being pushed to fight battles in a certain way. Like, Elfarian's kind of one of the worst examples in that respect, because he doesn't just require you to click a bunch of buttons, he requires you to play battles in a specific way to maximize his potential. Finally, it is the issue of scalability. Scalability in terms of economy, in terms of your actual empire on the campaign map. You do generally want to have an economy that is pretty solid early on. Not so ridiculous that you're swimming in money from the very beginning, because that can end up being too ridiculous. But an economy that is able to keep up with the demands you have in a campaign. So that actually building an empire one way or another, and this can take many different forms, whether or not you hold a lot of territory or very little territory, it's irrelevant. But having the economy, having the structures in order to keep up with the demands that you have on the campaign map. The dwarves are really great in this respect because they have an insane level of scalability. They start with a pretty solid economy. They get a lot more, especially if you invest in the deep. So it is an investment, but it does pay off. They can get a lot of money very quickly in their campaign. Then they can get a lot of money in the long term. So they're always keeping pace with the demands of the campaign. That is one element in terms of scalability. Then it's the question of being able to recruit heroes, having various benefits to your heroes, units, lords that do make them able to keep up with the demands of your campaign. And also having a really solid unit roster situation where from the very beginning of your campaign you do have a good selection of units, like the dwarves, as an example, because dwarf warriors are pretty solid, miners with blasting charges, pretty solid. They're always worthwhile using the campaign to a degree or another. Quarrelers, Thunderers, Iron Drakes, excellent units. Sure, there are some things that may not necessarily be worth using in a very long campaign, but regardless at which step of a campaign you are, from the very beginning until the very end, you always have new and interesting options to use. One of the criticisms I would have with regards to, say, the Dark Elves as an example, or with the High Elves, is with the High Elves, a lot of the interesting stuff are acquired so very late on that it doesn't matter. With the Dark Elves, you have a lot of the interesting stuff front-loaded, but it's not necessarily so interesting later on. With a race like the Dwarves, you have really solid, interesting choices to make in terms of units, in terms of heroes, in terms of lords, from the very beginning, and they get only more interesting later on, because yes, using things like gyro bombers, organ guns, iron breakers, hammers is all really fun. Not every unit may be worth recruiting, or at least not efficient, but you do eventually get thunder barges and slayers and all that kind of stuff in a campaign. So you do have this journey in a campaign from the beginning until the end of it, where you're always feeling you're getting rewarded for playing the game with new units to play around with various abilities and individual unit upgrades or campaign benefits. This can also take the form of a research tree that is worth investing in. Do you know how many races have a research tree that is flat out garbage and not worth considering whatsoever? The vast majority of them. The dwarves and a few others have research trees that feel so incredibly satisfying to actually get stuff, like getting Shield Wall, for instance, for units, or Charge Reflection for Grey Weapon Infantry, or Shield Wall of Gromrail for Ironbreakers Rand 7 and above. This is a really phenomenal research tree because it's always relevant throughout the course of the campaign. It's not just like, oh, you get some really good stuff early on, but then later on you don't care about it. Or you get some really good stuff, but only once you've spent 60 turns invested in this research tree. So it is these elements. It is how you handle your economy. It is how you handle your settlements. It is how you handle your armies. It is how you build those armies, the kind of choices you have, and the kind of choices that become available for those armies later on in a campaign. And all the things that I've talked about in this video, these are the key elements that can make for a really phenomenal campaign experience. Incidentally, one of the best races with respect to all of these elements are actually the dwarves. Guess why I've played so much of the dwarves after Thrones of the King? It's not because the dwarves are, so ridiculously powerful in terms of their other stuff. They can be, sure, Grumbrindle can be fucking ridiculous, I get it. But it's not that. It's because they do manage to strike that really amazing balance in a campaign, while also having stuff to do in a campaign. That might be the real final element, or post-it. It's like, yeah, actually having that dynamic campaign objectives to a degree, or long campaign objectives through Legendary Grudges adds on top of that. Or if you look at another campaign that's really great on all levels is our Build Undefeated and the objective-based campaign that he does have, as well as the scalability he also has. Though he's a bit too ridiculous in Autoresolve, I admit that much. Costin here signing out. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. If you have any ideas of what you would like me to cover next, please let me know. See you next time.